Hey everyone, so it's Hearth and welcome back to my channel. So on today's video, I'm going to be sharing with you some tips to start your Book of Shadows. So Books of Shadows are something that a lot of beginners get really excited to start, and I can understand why. They're a really entertaining part of magical practice. But a lot of people have questions and a lot of worries when it comes to creating a Book of Shadows. What if they mess it up? How do they write it? What do you write it in? What kind of book can you use? What if you make a spelling mistake? There are so many things that could go wrong with a Book of Shadows, and so many beginners get really worried about making a mistake. So I wanted to share with you just some things that really helped me in my Book of Shadows journey. Now, I have a lot of Books of Shadows. I've done several videos on it that I will link up here if you guys are interested in seeing inside just a few of my Books of Shadows. But I have a lot of them, and they vary from really cringy to kind of aesthetically pleasing and a lot of in between. And I've made a lot of mistakes. And for a lot of the time I've been practicing witchcraft, I had the ability to write in a Book of Shadows, but I always made excuses as to why I shouldn't. It's because I didn't have the right book or the right pen, or I was worried about making a mistake. And looking back, I realised that I really regret all of those years that I didn't use a Book of Shadows. And I want to spare someone else from that disappointment of looking back and realising that all of that stuff, all of that progress, I am never going to be aware of because I never wrote it down. So I have just a few of my Books of Shadows here. So I have this pentacle leather handmade book, and then I have this store-bought fancy ass notepad. And the first thing that I will say when it comes to Books of Shadows is don't worry about what it looks like. When you are in your practice and you are 5-10 years down the line, you're not going to care what your Book of Shadows looks like. You're going to care that you had it. You were writing stuff down in one. It doesn't matter whether it's a boring old book or whether it's a fancy ass leather pad like this. It doesn't matter. So if you are starting out, don't be afraid to just use what you have. If you have a blank plain notepad, maybe you're in the broom closet and your family doesn't know that you are a practitioner. Maybe you can't afford to go and buy a new book. Maybe we're in lockdown and you can't go out and buy a new book. If you already have books lying around that are empty or that you can make empty by taking out a few pages, that is completely adequate to be a Book of Shadows. It doesn't have to be a super fancy leather bound book like this. They can be super simple, super plain, just cheap store-bought notepads, and then you can use that for your magical practice. Now, the other thing that I want to say is that you don't have to have a physical book. A lot of people feel as though physical books are a requirement, and they definitely aren't. This one comes down largely to the idea of Charmed and TV shows like that have these giant books that are passed down through the family, and although that might be amazing, not everyone is going to have the ability to do that. Now, I have a lot of physical books, but I also have a Book of Shadows that's in a diary app that's on my phone. I also have a Book of Shadows in a OneDrive Word document that I can work on whether I'm on my phone, on my computer, whether I'm here or on holiday or staying at someone else's house. I have the ability to work on it whenever and wherever. It gives a lot of flexibility. If you don't necessarily want to physically write things down, you're able to type things out. Now, this is also a really good option if you do struggle with writing. If you struggle because you are shaky, because you have shakes, if you struggle to write because you're dyslexic or your handwriting isn't good or for whatever reason it might be, you can type it out online or you can dictate it through a computer or through your phone, so you can still have a Book of Shadows even if you aren't able to physically write anything or you really struggle to physically write things. That option is there for you if you do want to have things in an online document that you can dictate into or that has a spell checker in it, which is super useful. I really wish these things existed for real books because I'm dyslexic and my spelling is legit all over the place. It's everywhere, it's crazy. So it is really useful. If you do struggle with that, you can have an online Book of Shadows. Now, on top of this, You can actually print out pages that you've written online on Word documents or just in your online book of shadows. You can print them out and put them in a folder so you have them printed. This is really good if you struggle to read your own handwriting, or you struggle to read generally and you need things to be bigger, or you need certain font in order to read them. I know that a lot of people with dyslexia do struggle to read standard font. I have this experience myself, but if there is a particular font that you find you can read really easily, you can print things out in that font and you can put it in a folder and use a folder as your book of shadows. It's also really useful because then you can organize the pages as you see fit, so you don't have to worry about putting things in the wrong place in a written book of shadows. If you find a new piece of information that you want to slot into a pre-existing chapter, you are able to just open the clippers and slide in a new page, no worries. So it's really good for any of you that want a super organized book of shadows. You can do it that way and have it all in printed out sheets or even handwritten sheets that are in a clip or binding folder so that you can just move things around as and when you need them. Now, the next thing that I want to say is don't be scared of mistakes. I have so many spelling mistakes in my earlier books of shadows, and as much as at the time I wanted to rip that page out and start all over again or throw the entire book away because I messed it up so bad, I'm really glad that I didn't. Because now, 15 years down the line, I'm able to look back at that first book of shadows and go, this was me 15 years ago. This was my practice. This was my spelling. These were my mistakes 15 years ago. And so I would say never be afraid of mistakes. Don't feel as though you have to make the most perfectly written book on earth, because you don't. As long as you can understand the contents of it, doesn't need to be perfect. I have so many spelling mistakes in my books, it's unbelievable. Because I'm dyslexic, I put B's instead of M's and T's instead of B's, and there's a whole bunch of random letters thrown in there. But if I was to rip out a page every single time that I made a mistake, I wouldn't have a book of shadows left. And honestly, I'm really glad looking back that I didn't throw away the entire book because I made a mistake. Because even though there's spelling mistakes and there's things that are really, really wrong in there, like glaringly incorrect grammatical sentences, really bad, I'm so glad that I didn't get rid of them because that was who I was. That was my practice 15 years ago. And I have it written down and I'm so glad that I did. This book is a prime example of me being too scared to write stuff in it. I've had this book now for about 5 years. I've written maybe 12 pages because I've been so scared to write in it, and it's only now when I'm realizing, screw it. I don't care if I make mistakes, I don't care if my lines are wonky, I'm just gonna use it, because if I don't, the information that I'm holding now, I might not know in 5 years. Right now, I think that I'm gonna remember everything, but realistically, I'm not. So I should be using it and I should write it down. And I am definitely making steps to start doing that. And I would definitely suggest to anyone starting out, don't be afraid to make mistakes. Don't make the mistake that I did in being too scared to make a mistake, so I never wrote in it. So my next piece of advice is don't make a contents list. This is something that trips up so many people when they're starting out on their book of shadows. I have made this mistake so many times. You start a contents list and you're determined that everything is going to be in its suitable place. Everything is going to be perfect. But that's not the way we learn. We learn sporadically. We learn random bits of information at random times. And it's very, very difficult to get your contents list to match exactly what's in your book of shadows, because you're going to be finding new information as you go along. If you're starting a section on green witchcraft, I can guarantee you that you are not going to be able to learn everything that there is to know in the entire world about green witchcraft, and for you to put it in that tiny section of your book exactly where you need it. You're not going to be able to do it. And honestly, having a contents list is so distracting. I have a bunch of contents lists. I have them in here, hoping you're going to be able to see this. This is a content that I tried to do in this book of shadows, and I just had to give up on it. And actually, I only have a page and a little bit left, and nearly half a book still to fill. I'm never going to be able to fit everything in this book in the contents list, and 9 times out of 10, I don't use the contents list. I just flick through the books because they're not that big. So I do just kind of flick through the books, and not putting yourself under the pressure to have a contents majorly eases the stress of writing in a book of shadows. It stops you from second guessing yourself. I've done it where I've been writing a section and I've wanted to write something else in, but I've not finished the section that I've been on. And I've waited years before I write in that new bit because I was determined to finish that one section so it could go in the contents. And in the end, I lost so much information because I refused to write in my book. So if you do desperately want a contents for your book of shadows, I would recommend using a binding folder and using sheets of paper, because then you can really switch out the pages, add new information into a section at a later date, rather than having to have all the information right there and then. And then when you want to, once you're happy with your folder book of shadows, you can always transfer that information into a written book of shadows and do it that way if you wanted to. So the next is write in pencil first if you're worried. Now, in most of my books of shadows, I've gone straight in with pen, but there is one book, which is actually my most recent book, that I decided to do almost entirely in pencil, because then if I made any mistakes, I could really easily fix it before I went in with pen. So this one is my newest book of shadows. I actually only started writing in this last week and I'm almost finished. That is how much I have left to go, like this little section. And this is actually the first book that is almost entirely written in pencil, and I did that so that I could really easily go back in and correct any mistakes if I wanted to. So here is a little bit of this book of shadows. As you can see, everything is in pencil, and it just makes it so much less stressful, because I know that if I make a mistake, when I go over it in pen, I can fix that spelling mistake. If I've done something wrong, or I've written the wrong word, or I've used the wrong letter, which is something I do quite a lot, I am able to go back in and fix it when I do go over it in pen, and it does take so much stress off it. But I will say, if you are planning on doing this, I would recommend using a malleable rubber. So you often find them in drawing kits, or if you are a sketch artist, you'll likely use them. The malleable rubbers that you like massage, it's almost like blue tack, but it's like a rubber, like an eraser. And I would recommend using those if you do want to do this, because standard rubbers, in America you guys call it eraser, in England we call it a rubber. I know that rubber in America means something else. I don't want to see any comments about it because I know, but here they're called rubbers. Standard erasers are a lot harder than these elasticated erasers, and so when you rub you can leave marks. So I would recommend an elasticated, like massagey, I don't know what they're called. If you guys know what they're called, let me know. The elasticy, massagey, you rub it together and it looks like blue tack kind of eraser is the one that I would recommend if you are going to be doing this. So the next thing is, don't be afraid to add in notes. A lot of people are really scared to do this. They feel as though they have to get it word for word right straight off the bat, and you definitely don't need to. Make sure that you give yourself a little bit of space in order to fill in with notes. These might be corrections, they might be updates after you've done a working, or updates at a later date. So for instance, here I've given myself enough space to add this little addition in here because I forgot to add it into the contents list. Giving yourself the ability to add small little notes or retractions or alterations in your book of shadows makes it so much easier to get it right first time. Because if you do want to add something in, or you did add it in during another time that you did that working or when you did that spell, you're able to add it into your book of shadows as these little addition notes, and then you're not so worried about getting it absolutely word for word, item for item perfect every time, because that's really, really hard to do, and doing it this way gives you the ability to give yourself a little bit more leeway with it. Now, another good tip that I always like, but it's because I really like drawing, is if you want to better explain what you mean, draw an illustration. If it's a particular altar setup, or you want something to be written on a petition in a certain way, if you want a candle to look a very particular way before you burn it, draw an image of it. It makes it so much easier to explain to yourself at a later date what you meant if you have it in a drawing. Now, they don't have to be perfect. You don't have to have beautiful watercolors or sketches. It can be like stickmen if that's all you can do. It's just a way of letting you know what you meant. So if you struggle to put your words out in a way that is going to make sense to you at a later date, maybe drawings will work. Now, you don't have to be a master artist, but little sketches can massively help you get your point across way easier. Now, I have a feeling that it is because of books that appear in Charmed and TV shows and movies like Practical Magic and Sabrina. A lot of people feel as though their Book of Shadows has to be really beautiful to other people. I can say that 9 times out of 10, if someone has a Book of Shadows, they are the only person that sees it. So the most important thing when it comes to a Book of Shadows is that you understand what you are writing in it. It's so much easier when you start creating a Book of Shadows for yourself versus creating it for someone else. It is your magical diary. It's your journey through your craft, and so it should be made for you. It doesn't have to be on tea-stained paper. It doesn't have to be super beautiful and super aesthetically pleasing. It's a diary. It's a super bog standard item that you are going to be using again and again and again. It doesn't have to be perfect, and you can definitely alter it at a later date. Now, another thing is, don't write in a foreign language unless you know the foreign language well. I get a lot of beginners coming to me saying that they don't know what to do because they started writing their Book of Shadows in the Witch's alphabet or in Runic and they don't know how to continue it. I would say if you're going to be creating a Book of Shadows, stick to your main language or stick to a language that you know well. Don't try to convert all of your sentences into Latin and put them in a Book of Shadows. You are only going to confuse yourself unless you actually know how to write and read Latin. Same goes for any other language. Unless you're really well versed in translation, everything is going to get lost in translation. If you've never used Google Translate and run Latin backwards and forwards over it, it makes no sense when it comes out the other end. And if it doesn't make any sense to someone that knows Latin, it's not going to make any sense to you 10 years down the line when you try to run it into Google Translate and you get a bunch of nonsense. Same goes for Runic, same goes for the Witch's alphabet. It might sound like an amazing idea having a coded Book of Shadows, but unless you can read Latin or Elder Furthark or the Witch's alphabet like you can read English, it's going to take you 10 times as long to translate it, and it's going to take you 10 times as long to be able to read your own Book of Shadows. If you are worried about people finding your Book of Shadows, maybe do it online. Do it in a discrete format. Or save everything to memory for now and then write it out at a later date. Use the notes section on your phone if you have it. Use a Word document, whatever you need to. I would definitely not recommend writing your Book of Shadows in a foreign language unless it is a second language or it is your language. You know, if you know French and Spanish and English and you want to write your Book of Shadows in French, go for it if you know the language. But I get a lot of beginners coming to me complaining that their Book of Shadows makes no sense because they translated it into Latin via Google Translate and now can't translate it back again because it makes no sense. It's something a lot of people do. I would personally avoid it. It's also going to make it way more time consuming to write in your Book of Shadows. And a Book of Shadows is time consuming as it is. You don't need the extra hassle. Trust me. You really don't. I've been there, I've done that in some of my Books of Shadows I attempted to write in Runic and yeah, would not do that again, would not recommend. So one thing that I do a lot in my Books of Shadows that is really useful if you like pages to be full is fill small empty spaces with tips. So if you've written a spell and you have half a page that's left blank and you don't know what to put in it, rather than trying to squish something in, rather than trying to write as big as you can to fill the space or just having a big area of empty page, instead find little witchy tips that you can put in that section. So here is a recipe that didn't take very much space, and then at the bottom I've added in this little witchy tip for salt and pepper floor wash. And it really helps fill up that space. I'm also going to put one here eventually to kind of help fill up that space. But by putting in these little tips and these little hints in your Book of Shadows, it stops there being large areas of open empty space that can look really annoying when you go through your Book of Shadows. It's also a really good way of putting little hints in that don't have a huge page or a section for themselves. They're just little additions that don't really have anywhere else to go, and it's a really easy way to fill in empty space. So don't feel as though you have to force yourself to write 4 times bigger than you typically would write to fill in the space. Instead, Along the way, you're going to find little bits of information that you're definitely not going to need a full page for, and instead, you can add them in as witchy hints, make your book of shadows look way more aesthetically pleasing, and also have a place to put them. Now, a lot of beginners ask me, what do I do if I can't write in a straight line? So a lot of books of shadows that people will see are ones like this. So this is my leather book of shadows, my big one, and inside is just a bunch of handmade pages, just a whole bunch. And they are unlined. And luckily, I am reasonably good at writing in a straight line. Reasonably. I have my moments where I'm really bad at it, but on a day-to-day basis, I'm pretty good. But not everyone is going to be so good at writing in a straight line. And if you aren't good at writing in a straight line, there are options. These books, which I actually have a lot of, I probably have maybe 6 or 7 of this brand of book, are from a company called Paper Blanks. Now, they make really fancy looking books, but inside, the pages are lined. Now, this is not in any way affiliated with Paper Blanks, though. Paper Blanks, you ever want anyone to talk about your products? I'm over here. But I do really enjoy Paper Blanks because they give you the option of having a really fancy looking book, like the 2 that I have here. These are just the ones I have sitting next to me. They look really fancy. Some of them have these metal buckles on them. They have beautiful, beautiful pages. And they're lined, which is so much easier if you do struggle to write in a straight line on completely blank paper. If you can find yourself a really nice book like one of these, or just a standard notebook that you can change the cover on so that you can write really easily in a straight line and not have to worry about those pages where your writing is doing this. You start at the top and you end up in the middle and you're like, how am I doing this? How am I doing this? You guys know what I mean. This style of book with the fancy covers or with a cover that you can change and customize is a really good way of doing it because you do have the lined pages inside. So one thing that a lot of people writing in their book of shadows will do is that they will start writing in a medium that just isn't suitable. Either it's something that's so time consuming and so difficult that they can't maintain it, or it simply doesn't work for what you're writing on. So typically I find people writing in calligraphy. I did the same. This is about 8 years old and this is all in a calligraphy pen that proceeded to die like 2 pages later. And I could never ever find another pen like it. So my book of shadows is just weird and mismatched and not great. So people will often use calligraphy pens, or they will use something that's not suitable for the pages that they're writing on. So if you do have a book of shadows like this that is kind of leather with handmade paper, if you try to use a liquid ink based pen or liquid ink and a nib, you will find that it bleeds everywhere in these books. There is no real way that you can write in pen and ink, like liquid ink, on pages like this. You will end up with just all of your words just bleeding out. So I'd recommend, even though it might not look as nice, to work with something that you have around you readily available, that you can replace easily, and that is suitable for writing on the paper that you have. So I typically use black biros. It might be really bog standard, it might be really boring, but I know that no matter where I am, I can go out and I can buy a black biro that's going to look the same as every other black biro, so that I can just continue my book of shadows without there being any issues. There's no differences there. I have so many books of shadows where the writing has all bled, where it has become water stained and water damaged, where it's all faded because I used an ink that wasn't suitable, because I wanted it to look more traditional. And that's the issue. A lot of us feel as though a book of shadows has to look like it came out of the 16th century, and it doesn't. Books of shadows are actually a pretty modern thing. Although grimoires go back a very, very long time, books of shadows are pretty modern. We like to think that they should all look like they came out of the medieval period, but they don't need to. So I would say don't put yourself in more hazard as you need to. Don't be risking ruining your book of shadows because the ink has bled. Instead, use something that you have available and it's comfortable to you. That could be watercolor if you like using watercolor. That could be using biro. That could be pencil. You know, whatever it might be, just make sure that it's readily available, it's suitable for the paper, and make sure that you test it first. and that you can maintain it as you're going through your Book of Shadows, because sometimes you might finish your Book of Shadows in days. I have probably been writing in this for maybe a week and a half and I've nearly finished it. Whereas this one I've had for like 8 years and I still haven't finished it. So it can definitely take you a long time to finish a Book of Shadows, and you're gonna want to be able to finish it in a similar style as you started it. Now, one way to make everything make sense in your Book of Shadows, if you find that your brain is really disorganized, is to actually write it out separately, whether that be typed out, and then write it into your Book of Shadows once it's been spell checked. That's a really great way to make sure that you're wording everything correctly and that everything that's going in is what you want to go in. So that is a way of avoiding that, where you actually create a Book of Shadows online and you take years building this Book of Shadows. And then once you have enough, you write it all into your physical book in one sitting or over a few days, so that you get the writing to be the exact same, you get the spelling to be accurate, you can use the same pen, you have the same handwriting. It is a good way of avoiding that issue, but it is a little bit more time consuming and you're reliant on your computer or your page that you're writing it on not being corrupted over the amount of time that you are using it. So I'd say if you are planning on using any kind of online system, make sure it's backed up, because it's so easy for that to just be corrupt, and then that's years of your Book of Shadows just poof, 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 gone, just like that. So one of the last tips I have is to find a way to make mistakes look right. Now, I've had to do this for years because I do make a lot of spelling mistakes because of my dyslexia. So instead of scribbling through words, instead of scratching them out, I would recommend finding a way that makes it look like that mistake was never there, but makes it easy for you to read. So typically what I do when I've made a spelling mistake or I've written the wrong word is I put a slash and then I write the actual word. I don't cross out the word that came before it because it makes it look really obvious that you made a mistake. Instead, I will be writing, I put the wrong word or I spelt something really wrong and it makes no sense. I put a slash and then I write the word the way it was meant to be spelt, or the word I was after, and then you continue on. And if you keep that process through the entire book, you know what to do when you see that. You can then read it really easily without worrying about that mistake being there. You might want to tip-X it out if the pages are particularly white, although you'll often find that Books of Shadows do have yellowed pages. You can also just cross it out really neatly if you wanted to. You can just draw in the letters that you were intending to write. There's so many ways of doing it, but don't scribble out and rip pages out if you make a mistake. It's not worth it. Instead, just find a way to really effectively and quickly cover that mistake or move on with it, and then it's going to make your Book of Shadows look a lot better. And the last tip that I have is to continue writing. Don't let your brain tell you, I've got to throw the entire book in the bin, I've got to rip this page out, I've got to scribble it, I just want to scribble over the entire page. You don't need to. I can promise you, don't do it. It's not worth it. Keep writing. Even if your pen dies and you have to use a different colour of pen, even if you've made a mistake and you hate it and it's so obvious, keep writing. Trust me on this. I have lost so many Books of Shadows because I was so angry at myself for making a mistake. How could I make a mistake? Why did I make a mistake? That I am missing a handful of books that I will never get back because I threw them away, because I ripped all the pages out, because I destroyed them, because I was so angry and frustrated that I'd made a mistake. It's not worth doing. 5 years down the line, 8 years down the line, 20 years down the line, it doesn't matter what that book looks like, you're going to be grateful that you have it. So no matter what your artistic skill is, it doesn't need to be a beautiful book, even if your handwriting is terrible, even if you make so many spelling mistakes, you have so many corrections, keep writing. Because when you're later down the line and you're looking back on your magical journey, you are going to be so grateful that you kept writing in that damn book, even though you made all of those mistakes. And it's something that I really regret for my magical practice, and I desperately don't want any of you guys to have the same feelings of regret with your Books of Shadows as I do with mine. So those are all the tips that I have for you today. I really hope that this is helpful for someone who wants to start their Book of Shadows but is really scared to or doesn't know where to begin. I really hope this helps. If it did, feel free to like the video. It really means a lot. It helps me know which ones you like and which ones you don't like. Let me know if you have destroyed any of your books of shadows because you were angry with yourself, or let me know any tips that you have for starting a book of shadows that other people might want to know. Please feel free to put them down in the comment section. I'd love to read them. I'd love to read your tips for starting books of shadows because I think a lot of beginners really don't know where to start. If you do have any questions, comments, concerns, video ideas, or just want to chit chat with the community, feel free to put it down in the comment section. We've got a lovely community down there, and also in the description box we have a Discord server where you can chat all about books of shadows or anything else regarding magic in the Discord server with a bunch of people from all around the world. It's really, really fun in there. And if you do enjoy the magical content on this channel or in this video, feel free to hit subscribe. I do try my best to post magical content every Wednesday and every Saturday at 6 p.m. So I hope you guys have a marvelous magical day. I hope that you are all staying safe, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!